All right, so we're back with another deep dive for you.
Back again.
This time, we're looking at Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's We Should All Be Feminists.
Yes.
Have you had a chance to read this one yet?
I have. It's a fascinating book.
It is. It's very powerful, but also very, very concise.
Concise and powerful. I think that's a good way to describe it. You know, it started as a TEDx talk, actually.
Really?
Yeah, back in 2012 at TEDx Houston.
Yeah.
And it was really intended as a way to kind of start a conversation, particularly among, Africans and friends of Africa. But the ideas that she explores in this book have really resonated with people far beyond that initial audience.
Yeah, and one of the things I think is so interesting is how she takes on this word feminist, which, can be kind of loaded for people.
Absolutely.
And she really kind of cuts through a lot of the noise and the baggage to get to the heart of what does this really mean and why does it matter?
Yeah.
In your life and in the world around us. So we're going to take a deep dive and explore some of the key insights that she offers.
That's good.
So one of the first things that Adichie does is she shares her own experience with the term.
Right.
And she talks about how when she's about 14, she got into an argument with a childhood friend named Okoloma, and he called her a feminist as an insult.
Well, it's an insult.
Yeah, and it really highlights how even in personal everyday interactions, this word can carry, all this negative baggage.
It's fascinating how some words get so much baggage attached to them.
Well, I think it's really striking to imagine being a young teenager and having this label thrown at you as if it's a weapon.
Right.
She didn't even really fully grasp what it meant at the time, but she knew it wasn't a good thing.
Yeah.
And then that really sets the stage for her later exploration of why this word evokes such strong reactions in people.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because it wasn't just a childhood incident.
Right.
Later on in her career, when she was already a writer, she was advised by a well-meaning journalist to avoid calling herself a feminist.
What?
Yeah, it was a journalist who was trying to help her,
Oh, so they thought it would hurt her image.
That's exactly it. The reasoning was that it would make her seem like an unhappy woman who just couldn't find a husband.
Oh, wow.
So there was this idea out there that, feminists are unhappy.
They're all these angry spinsters.
Exactly. And then on top of that, there was a whole other layer of this idea that feminism was somehow un-African or a foreign concept, like it didn't belong.
It's almost absurd, the mental gymnastics she had to go through to just define herself.
Yeah.
So you have happy feminist, happy African feminist who does not hate men.
Right.
It really shows how much negative baggage the term carries. And as she points out, it's often tied to all these stereotypes, hating men, hating bras, hating African culture, being angry all the time.
Yeah, like this laundry list of negative attributes.
So it's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
And what I think is so effective about Adichie's argument is how she weaves in these very personal anecdotes to illustrate these much broader societal issues. So, for example, she tells a story from when she was in primary school in Nigeria.
Okay.
And it was time to select a class monitor.
Right.
And she had the highest score on the test. So clearly she was both capable and interested.
Yeah, she was the best.
In taking on this responsibility.
Right.
And she was excited about it. She was looking forward to wielding that cane that, they give the class monitor.
Oh, yeah.
But then the teacher just matter-of-factly says the class monitor has to be a boy. It wasn't even a question. It was just like the assumed order of things.
It was just the way it was.
So it really highlights how deeply ingrained this idea was, that leadership in any form was a male domain.
Even at that young age?
Even at that young age in primary school.
Yeah.
And the irony is that the boy who ended up being chosen, because he had the second highest score, was a rather gentle soul who didn't really want the role.
Oh, so he wasn't even interested.
No, he wasn't really interested.
And she was raring to go.
Yeah, but he was chosen because he was a boy. And so it really illustrates how gender, rather than actual ability or interest, dictated roles.
From day one.
From a very young age.
Yeah, and it makes you think, about how we start to unconsciously categorize potential based on something as arbitrary as gender.
Yeah, and Adichie says, if we do something over and over again, it becomes normal.
It becomes normal.
So if we only ever see boys appointed as class monitor, eventually we just come to accept that as the natural order.
Like it's the way it should be.
And she draws a direct line from this early experience to the broader societal phenomenon of seeing predominantly men as heads of corporations.
Right.
It starts to feel natural, even though it originates from a learned bias.
Not inherent truth.
Right.
You know?
And then she shares the perspective of a friend of hers named Louis,
Okay.
who is a man who considers himself progressive, but who initially struggled to fully grasp the ongoing realities of gender inequality. And he would say things like, everything is fine now for women.
Oh, so he was one of those guys.
Yeah, and it really highlights how individuals in a position of privilege can sometimes have a blind spot when it comes to recognizing the systemic disadvantages that others face.
It's hard to see those structures sometimes when you're not experiencing the negative effects of them personally.
Right, and there's a really great anecdote about a parking attendant in Lagos that really brought Louis' blind spot into sharp focus.
All right.
So Adichie and Louis were together, and they tipped the parking attendant, and the attendant automatically directed his thanks to Louis.
Assuming that Louis was the one who had paid.
Yeah, just assuming that the money had ultimately come from the man.
Just because he was a man?
Right, and it was just such a common, almost invisible, everyday occurrence.
I've seen that happen myself so many times.
Right. It's like the underlying assumption is that men are the primary providers, the ones in control of resources and finances. And it was so ingrained that the attendant didn't even consider any other possibility. And it raises the question for all of us, like, how often do we make similar assumptions?
Based on gender.
Yeah.
Without even thinking about it.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating.
And Adichie is careful to acknowledge the biological differences between men and women.
Right.
You know, the different hormones, different reproductive capabilities.
Sure.
But she emphasizes that while men might generally possess greater physical strength,
On average.
those are simply not the qualities that should be the primary determinants of leadership and power in the modern world.
In the modern world, yeah.
I mean, we value intelligence, knowledge of creativity, problem solving, and those attributes are not inherently tied to one's gender.
No, they're not. You know, it's interesting. We've made incredible strides in technological and intellectual evolution.
Yeah.
But our fundamental ideas about gender roles and capabilities, they haven't necessarily kept pace.
They really haven't.
She uses the example of the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act in the United States.
Yeah.
Which, you know, highlights the basic injustice of men being paid more than women for doing the exact same job with the same qualifications.
Just because they're men.
Yeah. And that really makes you think about the economic consequences of these outdated gender biases.
Absolutely. And she provides some really striking examples from her own life.
Okay.
About the everyday indignities and limitations that women face.
Like what?
So she talks about being harassed by a hotel guard.
Oh, wow.
And being denied entry to clubs in Lagos.
Seriously.
Because she was alone.
Just because she was a woman on her own.
Yeah, and it really underscores how women are often seen as, you know, needing male accompaniment.
Right.
Or as somehow illegitimate if they're out in public on their own.
Or even worse, they're immediately assumed to be sex workers just because they're alone.
Yeah, and it's not just inconvenient, it's infuriating.
Of course.
It speaks to this fundamental lack of respect and autonomy.
Absolutely. And as Adichie points out, these are not isolated incidents. These are reflections of a society that has consciously or unconsciously deemed men to be more legitimate.
More deserving of respect.
More worthy of respect and independent action.
And she also mentions this seemingly small frustration of being in restaurants where waiters will consistently address the men at the table.
Yeah, I've seen that.
And completely ignore the women, even if the women are the ones placing the order.
Oh, yeah, like we're invisible.
Right. And she says, sometimes it is the little things that sting the most.
Because they just constantly reinforce this feeling of being invisible or marginalized.
Exactly. And it's interesting because all of this leads to her thoughts on the concept of anger.
Okay.
So she talks about how she wrote an article about the experience of being young and female in Lagos. And someone labeled it as angry.
Angry.
And she was unapologetic about it.
Good for her.
Because gender inequality is a grave injustice.
Yes, it is.
And feeling and expressing anger in response to injustice is not only valid, it can be a powerful catalyst for change. But there's this double standard, right?
Oh, huge double standard.
Women are cautioned against expressing anger.
Because it's unfeminine.
Right. It's seen as threatening, irrational, or simply unfeminine.
Exactly.
She illustrates this with an anecdote about her American friend who took over a managerial position that was previously held by a man. And the same behaviors that were lauded in him.
Like a tough go-getter.
Right.
Yeah.
Led to her being labeled as aggressive and difficult to work with.
Just for doing the same things?
Yeah, and there was this underlying expectation that she should somehow bring a more nurturing...
Like a woman's touch.
Right, a woman's touch to the role.
It's so unfair.
And it just reinforces these incredibly limiting and often damaging gender stereotypes.
About how men and women should behave.
Right.
Especially in the workplace.
And it's not just about the expression of anger.
Okay.
Adichie also delves into how much women are socialized from a very young age to prioritize being liked.
Oh, being likable.
And this pressure to be agreeable and likable.
Can often prevent women from speaking up, from disagreeing.
Right.
Or from being assertive.
Because they're afraid of being perceived negatively.
Right. All out of this fear of being perceived negatively.
Meanwhile, boys are raised to be, leaders and go-getters.
Well, and so it really has an impact on their respective abilities to navigate the world and advocate for themselves.
For sure. So basically what you're saying is women are raised to be more passive and agreeable, and men are raised to be more assertive and go after what they want.
And this pressure to be likable extends into relationships and marriage.
Oh, yeah.
So girls are often taught that marriage should be a primary aspiration.
A key goal in life.
Whereas boys are not raised with that same level of emphasis or expectation.
Right.
And this threat of remaining unmarried or jeopardizing a marriage is much more frequently used as a form of social control against women.
Against women.
Yeah.
And it's like their worth is tied to their marital status.
Right. Adichie also talks about how we raise boys and how we do them a disservice.
In what way?
By confining them to such a narrow and restrictive definition of masculinity.
Okay.
Like this hard, small cage where they're systematically taught to suppress any display of vulnerability.
Any expression of fear.
Right. They have to be the strong, silent type all the time.
Right. And they're constantly pushed to embody this ideal of the hard man.
Which is not a realistic or healthy ideal.
And she argues that this leads to incredibly fragile egos.
That are easily threatened.
Right.
And this fragility, then, has a direct impact on how girls are raised.
How so?
Because they're often taught, either explicitly or implicitly, to cater to these fragile male egos.
Oh, to sort of shrink themselves.
Yeah, to shrink themselves, to downplay their ambitions and successes so as not to emasculate men.
Emasculate.
That's a word that Adichie expresses her deep dislike for.
Yeah, I mean, why should a woman's success or achievement ever be perceived as a threat to a man's sense of self-worth?
Exactly.
And she tells the story about how she was once asked
What?
whether she ever worried about intimidating men.
Seriously, they asked her that.
Yeah, and it really highlights this ridiculous expectation that women should constantly tailor their lives.
To avoid making men feel insecure.
And her response is perfect.
What'd she say?
She said that any man who would be intimidated by her is precisely the kind of man she would have absolutely no interest in.
Good for her. What a great answer.
It's a powerful reclaiming of agency.
Yeah.
Adichie also touches on the language we use around marriage.
Okay.
Which is so often framed in terms of ownership rather than partnership.
Like the man is the head of the household and the woman is his property.
Right. And the concept of respect within relationships also comes under scrutiny.
In what way?
So it often seems that respect is something that a woman is just expected to show a man.
Simply because he's a man.
But not necessarily the other way around.
Right, so the expectation is not equal.
Right, and this imbalance really underscores the power dynamics at play.
Yeah, and the idea of compromise also disproportionately falls on women.
In what way?
So women are more likely to be expected to give up career opportunities.
Oh, personal dreams.
For the sake of the marriage.
Right, whereas men talk about compromise, it's often about relinquishing, bad behaviors.
Well, like things they shouldn't have been doing in the first place.
Right.
So they're not really compromising on anything important.
So again, it points to this fundamental asymmetry in how these negotiations play out.
Adichie also points out how girls are often raised to view each other as competitors.
For male attention.
Yeah, primarily for male attention.
Yeah, rather than as potential collaborators and allies.
Right, they're pitted against each other.
Right, and there's this persistent difference in how we view male and female sexuality.
How so?
So girls and women are subjected to much greater levels of policing and shaming
regarding their sexuality
in ways that boys and men are not.
It's a double standard again.
And she shares this really harrowing example of a young woman who was gang raped in Nigeria.
Oh, gosh.
And the victim blaming that followed. And it's a horrible but illustrative example of how deeply ingrained these harmful gender biases are.
Yeah.
So there was this almost automatic assumption of the woman's guilt.
Or culpability.
Coupled with these shockingly low expectations placed on men's capacity for self-control.
Like boys will be boys.
Right. And it really forces you to confront some uncomfortable truths about prevailing attitudes.
For sure. And this leads to her point about how girls are often taught shame from a very young age.
To close their legs.
Yeah.
To cover themselves.
To feel guilty for being female.
Right. And this constant installation of shame has profound consequences.
How so?
It leads to women silencing themselves, feeling unable to express their desires or their true thoughts.
Right.
And essentially becoming masters of pretense in order to navigate a world that judges them so harshly.
So they have to pretend to be someone they're not.
She gives this example of a woman who secretly dislikes domestic work.
Okay.
But pretends to enjoy it to be seen as good wife material.
Oh, gosh.
And then is criticized for changing after marriage.
It's like she can't win.
Right. And Adichie's point is that the fundamental problem with gender is that it dictates how we should be.
Based on these arbitrary societal expectations.
Instead of recognizing and embracing how we actually are.
As individuals.
As unique individuals.
Right.
And she suggests that there would be this incredible sense of liberation.
If we could just be ourselves.
If we were no longer burdened by these rigid and often suffocating gender expectations.
Yeah.
If we could just have the freedom to be our authentic selves.
Without the pressure to conform.
And while acknowledging the biological differences
between men and women.
She emphasizes how societal socialization vastly exaggerates these differences.
Right, and creates these self-fulfilling prophecies about what we're capable of.
And interested in.
Based on our gender.
And she uses the example of cooking.
Okay.
Which is a task predominantly performed by women in many societies.
Right.
Yet the most celebrated chefs are overwhelmingly men.
Exactly. So it challenges this idea that roles are somehow innate.
Biologically determined.
Right.
She reflects on the experiences of her grandmother's generation.
Okay.
And the limited opportunities that were available to them because they were women.
Yeah.
And while acknowledging that there has been progress through changes in policy and laws,
right.
She stresses that our underlying attitudes and mindsets
will be even more crucial
for achieving true and lasting equality.
Because laws can only do so much.
They can't change hearts and minds.
Exactly.
And so this leads to her central call to action.
What is this?
To focus on fostering and valuing individual ability and genuine interest in children.
Rather than imposing gender stereotypes.
And she tells a story about parents who automatically tell their daughter to cook for her brother.
Simply because he's male.
Even though she dislikes cooking.
And he's perfectly capable of learning.
And it highlights how these ingrained biases perpetuate inequality from the earliest stages of life.
Right, from the get-go.
So imagine the ripple effects if both boys and girls were taught essential life skills.
Like cooking and cleaning.
Right. And if we didn't automatically praise fathers for doing basic childcare tasks.
But instead saw it as a normal and shared part of parenting.
These seemingly small shifts in our thinking
could have a huge impact.
Could have a profound impact on future generations.
I think so.
Adichie also shares her own experience of feeling pressure to present herself in a more manly way.
Okay.
When she first started teaching her writing classes.
Because she was afraid of not being taken seriously.
Right, because she was a young female instructor.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that we still equate masculinity with authority.
Right, and femininity with a lack thereof.
It's a stereotype we need to break.
And she realized that she should have just worn what made her feel comfortable and authentic without apology or self-consciousness.
It's a good message.
It's a powerful message about embracing one's own femininity.
In all its forms.
And demanding respect on one's own terms.
I like it. The male gaze should not be the driving force behind a woman's choices. She acknowledges that these conversations about gender can be uncomfortable.
Or awkward.
But they're absolutely necessary.
Right.
We have to have them.
And she addresses some common objections to feminism.
Like what?
Like the argument that we should just focus on human rights.
Instead of gender rights.
But her response is that that approach ignores the specific historical oppression that women have faced.
It was erasing their experiences.
And she also addresses the argument that poor men experience hardship too. And she clarifies that while class and gender are distinct forms of inequality,
Right.
they often intersect,
Yeah.
and that even poor men still benefit from male privilege.
Within a patriarchal society.
And she debunks the idea of bottom power.
Or does
This idea that women have power by manipulating men.
Oh, I've heard that.
And she says it's not real power.
It's relying on someone else's power.
It's conditional approval.
Right. It's not real power.
She also tackles the "it's just our culture" argument
Well, that's a common one.
by pointing out that culture is not static
It's created by people
and therefore can be changed.
and should be changed if it's harmful.
Right. She gives examples from her own Igbo culture,
Okay.
where she feels a connection to tradition but is still excluded from decision-making
Just because she's a woman.
because of her gender.
Yeah.
And it highlights the limitations and inequalities of clinging to outdated traditions.
Just for the sake of tradition.
And her point is that if our culture doesn't recognize and value the full humanity of women,
We need to change it.
it's our responsibility to reshape it.
It's interesting how she comes full circle back to Okoloma, her childhood friend.
The one who called her a feminist as an insult.
And now she embraces the label
Yeah.
with pride.
And it's worth remembering that when she looked up the definition of feminist in the dictionary,
What did it say?
it was very simple and straightforward.
Okay.
A person who believes in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes.
That's it.
That's it. It's
Yeah.
about fairness and equality.
Yeah. But it's so often misunderstood.
Twisted and distorted.
Exactly.
She shares this inspiring example of her Greek-grandmother,
Okay.
who in her own way defied societal norms.
Even without knowing the word feminist.
Without ever knowing that word.
Right. And Adichie offers her own definition of a feminist.
Which is
Anyone, regardless of gender, who recognizes the problem with how gender functions in the world
and believes that we should fix it.
and create a better future for all.
So to wrap up this deep dive into Chimamanda and Ngozi Adichie's, we should all be feminists.
Yeah.
Let's remember that crucial definition.
Okay.
A feminist is a person who believes in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes.
It's really that simple.
And remember Adichie's call for all of us to acknowledge the problems with gender as it currently operates.
And to work towards a more just and equitable future.
Think about Adichie's idea of raising children by focusing on their abilities and interests.
Rather than gender roles.
Could that be the key to a fairer world?
It's an interesting thought.
And perhaps the most hopeful takeaway is this reminder that culture is not immutable.
Right.
It's created by people and can be reshaped to embrace the full humanity of everyone.
That's a powerful message.
It is. If you enjoyed this deep dive and want to explore more impactful books,
Be sure to follow
Bookish Dives.
for your daily dose of book summaries.
Until next time, keep those pages turning and those minds open.
See you next time.